Welcome to the Pioneer Podcast. This is Ernst Rutz. Before we delve into today's episode, I want to let you know that our first newsletter will be issued shortly. In this newsletter, we provide some feedback on where the Afrikaner Foundation stands and what we have been doing since our soft launch on the 4th of July 2024. So if you're listening to this episode shortly after the publication thereof, you can still catch this newsletter by subscribing on our website, afrikaner.org. If you're listening to this podcast later, you are obviously still welcome to subscribe for future newsletters. Now, in today's episode, I want to share with you the conversation I had with Gavin Wax, the president of the New York Young Republican Club. Gavin Wax is a good friend whom I've met in Budapest several years ago at CPAC, where we were both speakers at this conference. And we spent some time talking about South Africa and obviously America and American politics and also the situation in South Africa. I have had the opportunity to meet the leadership of the New York Young Republican Club, who in time have also become good friends. Now, Gavin Wax is a person that has a bright future in American politics and in the Republican Party especially. And this is not just my own opinion. During a recent rally in New York City, President Donald Trump singled out Gavin Wax as a person involved with politics in New York that has a bright future. Now, this discussion that I'm about to share with you was recorded shortly after the assassination attempt of Donald Trump and just after Joe Biden has announced that he has dropped out of the race for the upcoming election. It was on the day in which I spoke at the New York Young Republican Club in New York City. You might have listened to the speech on this podcast or on social media. So during my conversation with Gavin, we spoke about American politics. We spoke about what might happen in the election, the prospects of someone like Kamala Harris. We spoke about the nature of the political struggle in America and how to make sense of it if you are an outsider, if you don't live in America, if you have strong opinions about the approach and the style of someone like Donald Trump, for example, how to understand what is happening. And we also spoke about the situation in New York City, the more local situation, and what the Republican Party, at least, are doing. And then we also spoke about a topic or an issue that I am especially interested in, and that is the success of the New York Young Republican Club. When Gavin became the president of this particular club a few years ago, it was a fairly insignificant club with very little influence, or at least much less influence than it has today. And as we speak today, it is the chapter of the Young Republicans across America that is certainly the biggest and the most active and the most influential. In fact, it was recently announced to be one of the most influential associations in New York City. And so I'm very proud to have been invited to speak at one of the events recently. And we are also very proud to be associated with the New York Young Republican Club. So with that, here is my conversation with Gavin Wax. Gavin Wax, thank you very much. Thank you for speaking with me.
It's great to be here.
So, as we're recording this, it'll be published a week or two after the recording, but the latest we've heard in American politics now is the news with President Joe Biden, who was dropped out, and Kamala Harris is now in his place. Is it safe to predict what's going to happen in terms of her? Do you think she's going to become president before the election? How do you see things running out, and also the prospects for Trump in the upcoming election?
Well, I don't think it's safe to predict anything at this point. It's been a tumultuous few weeks. We're kind of in unprecedented territory in terms of our politics and our political situation. Having a sitting president, step down from running this close to election day is sort of unheard of. The way he did it was unheard of, without an accompanying video address, without even a photo or anything. And the fact that now we're getting a nominee who, no one voted for, there was no primary process. She never won a single primary vote. Everything we're seeing, in addition, of course, we can't even forget the attempted assassination attempt of the president just 9-10 days ago. I mean, this has been a whirlwind of a week. The expression goes, there are years where nothing happens and days where years happen. I think that's what we're seeing unfold in American politics. So really can't predict anything. I mean, if you told me that we will have a President Harris before November, I could see that potentially happening. If you told me Harris won't be the nominee, maybe something happens last minute at the convention, I could believe that. I mean, if you told me that, any number of things. Right now, we're in uncharted territory, and it's presenting itself in a way that it's going to make it very hard to predict the future, to really have an understanding of which way this election is going to go, just because, historically, you rely on historical analysis, you rely on historical trends. We don't really have anything to point to for this cycle, so it's going to be an interesting time.
Well, exactly. That's my next question, that this seems to be sort of a new thing. The question then is, why is there such turmoil? Does it say something about the deterioration of American politics, or the situation within the government, or the Democrats, or is it just a fluke?
No, I think it says a lot about all of the institutions and that you mentioned, and of course our government. I think we'll start with the Democrat Party. I mean, I think this is a group of very ruthless people that are willing to use whatever tactics they need to consolidate power, to expand their power, to maintain their power. And if that means effectively forcing President Joe Biden out of office, I think they are fully willing and able to do that. I don't think that he necessarily did this on his own volition. I think there was a lot of negotiation. I think there was a lot of strong arming. I think there were a lot of threats, and I think it was, compounded ultimately by his health, yes, but it certainly was a rocky road to get him to agree not to run again. I mean, again, his statements just a few days prior to all of this was diametrically opposed to what ended up happening and what he ended up issuing in his signed statement. So I think it shows that the Democrat Party right now is in a state of chaos, that no one really knows who's in charge of the Democrat Party. It's being run effectively by a few oligarchs, a few elites, a few superdelegates, a few shadowy figures who are pulling the strings. Some people have said Obama, some have said others. And I think that's also the same could be said about our government writ large. I think it's also being run by shadowy figures, nameless, faceless people in this, federal leviathan, this federal bureaucracy that are pulling the strings. And I think that's basically the type of government, the type of rule that they want to force on all of us. It's not a republic. It's not representative democracy. It's something else entirely. And everything else is just a show. It's just a veneer. And I think that veneer is coming off rather quickly. I think that they are trading away legitimacy and respectability for pure power. And I think, you could do that in the short term. You can't do that in the long term. That's when this sort of happens in history, when you're at the ends of a regime, when a regime feels threatened, when a regime feels cornered. And I think we're seeing a regime in the Democrat Party and a regime in the government that feels a little bit desperate right now. And they're making desperate, radical moves for their own, self-preservation. But I think right now we have an issue of corruption. We have an issue of lack of transparency. And frankly, we have an issue of competence. And I think it's a very dangerous trifecta.
So what does this say about democracy? Because it's strange that just a week ago, perhaps less, we heard some of the strategists for the Democratic Party say that there's no way that Biden can step down and be replaced because he was elected by all these people. And so it would be a violation of democracy for him to withdraw, because what happens to all these people who voted for him? And just a few days thereafter, it actually happened.
Listen, I think democracy has become nothing more than a buzzword. It doesn't mean anything, democratically elected officials and, policies that are supported by the vast majority of people are, pushed aside in the name of democracy. I mean, they use democracy as this fungible term that could be contorted any which way to suit their narrative. It doesn't really mean anything anymore. I mean, in many cases, the policies being promoted by Western elites are inherently anti-democratic. They're against the will of the people as it relates to issues such as migration, such as cultural issues, such as, who they would like to see in office. We saw even recently in some of the elections across Europe where, obviously they have a different system. It's not first past the post. It's, in the UK, it's first past the post, but in France, it's a two-tiered, a two-round system. You have right-wing parties, whether it's Reform in the United Kingdom or the Front National in France, that are winning larger percentages. They're winning larger raw votes, and they're not getting a proportional number of seats in their legislative bodies. And people say, well, this is democracy, and it just goes to show that they will use this term, they will beat this term to death if they have to, because it really means little to them. It means nothing to them. It's simply a propaganda tool to vindicate their own positions, to vindicate their framing of a political situation. And you mentioned the example with Joe Biden. 1 week they're saying, why would he have to step down? It's the will of the people that he be in office and that he continue. And now the whole party line has changed almost as quickly as it was uttered. So it just goes to show changing allegiances, changing party lines, changing frames, changing narratives. They can't keep up with it, and it's hard to keep up with it. And I think that's almost part of the intent. It's to confuse. It's to instill a sense of chaos, which also instills a sense of fear. And through those senses, one can govern in a more totalitarian way.
Yeah. So I want to take it back then to New York and the work that you guys are doing. And the New York Young Republicans were sitting in your clubhouse. I've spoken here in the past, and it's really impressive. And it's really impressive to see what you guys are doing. And I've heard that about 5 years ago, you were fairly small. You had about 60 members. Now you have 1,200 or something. And to be a member, it's not just to sign a petition.
Correct. You have to pay.
You have to pay to be a member. And it's the biggest and it's the most active chapter of the Young Republicans. So my question is, what is the secret to success? Why is the New York Young Republicans such a force in American politics?
Well, the New York Republican Club, we've been around for a while, well over 100 plus years. It goes back to the 1850s. And we welcomed President Lincoln originally to come speak in New York. That started his political career. That was the New York Young Men's Republican Union. It transformed into the New York Young Men's Republican Club, and eventually became the New York Young Republican Club. So we've had many, notable alumni. We have had many famous members, presidents, vice presidents, Supreme Court justices, senators, governors, mayors, you name it. We've had many people that have come through our organization in times past. The club has had several thousand members, more than 5,000, with multiple different clubhouses. Sadly, as an institution, it fell on hard times. I took over in 2019, and it was kind of at a low point in terms of our membership, in terms of our activity. It still was a storied institution, had a strong legacy, had a good name, but on the fundamentals, in terms of membership, in terms of events, in terms of political influence, publicity, it really fell to an all-time low. So we revitalized the organization, we professionalized it, and more importantly, we shifted it ideologically, shifting it to the right, embracing Trump, embracing populism, this sort of America First conservative movement. And this is the exact opposite sort of direction that we were told to take by the previous leaders of this organization. They said, well, if you're based in New York, you have to be more liberal, you have to be more moderate, you have to run to the center. And we said, there's really no point for that. If you're a Republican in New York, if you're a conservative in New York, you're a minority, you're an outspoken minority, and you're willing to stick to your guns, you're willing to fight for your own principles and beliefs. And I think people are looking for change. They're looking for actual counter views, counter points to the left-wing dominance of the city's government and political and cultural scene. And if we're just trying to be Democrat light, there's really no point to join us. So I think our thesis was proven correct. Within a few months of taking over, we got hundreds of new members joined. Our events started getting hundreds of people. We've had events, at our gala most recently with President Trump at Cipriani Wall Street, which is the largest ballroom in the country, one of the most expensive ballrooms in the country to host an event. We had over 1,000 people there for a black tie dinner. We've had several hundred people attend multiple events of ours, rallies. We have over 1,000 dues paying members. And we've continued to grow and expand as a result of a lot of these changes and reforms that we've made. So we're very happy with all this success. Obviously, we're sitting here in our small clubhouse. We hope to have a bigger one soon, but even having our own little place in this city is a testament to our growth. We've won battles in terms of our litigation that we've waged. We've upended unconstitutional maps that have been drawn here in New York. We've led massive rallies and protests. We've won races. We've won city council seats. We've won judgeships. We've won congressional seats. We've won seats for state legislature and beyond. And we've staffed those offices as well. So we're an all-encompassing organization. I think that was part of our success. We weren't simply trying to be strictly a political organization. We weren't simply trying to be just a social organization or just a sort of intellectual academic organization. You can come and listen to great speakers and thinkers. You can come and socialize and meet people, and you can also come and be engaged in the political process and a grassroots sort of activism. And because we've built a holistic institution, we've seen the fruits of that labor in terms of our membership, in terms of our funding. We're entirely primarily funded by our membership dues. We're $1 million plus a year organization. We host these large events. We, staff, we have, work with tons of vendors and tons of staff, and, all this is done by volunteers. And I think, again, that's a testament to the growth we've seen. And I think despite it all, people have to remember that New York City, even though it's overwhelmingly left-leaning, overwhelmingly Democratic, we still have about a third of the vote here, and a third of 8 million people is still a sizable portion, a sizable number of people. And there's large Republican enclaves here in New York and some of the boroughs. There's still many conservatives that move here. There's still many conservatives that live here. And we want to be an institution that represents them, that activates them, and that continues to fight the good fight deep behind enemy lines here in the Big Apple.
So there's something here that I think is very important, and that's applicable not just to New York, but to all of us in South Africa and the conservative movement in general. As you said, that New York is generally seen as a blue state that's very Democrat and liberal or left-wing. And one would think that the way forward for the Republicans in New York is to be sort of more centrist, closer to the Democrats. And you've gone the opposite way. You've gone farther from the center or the mainstream, and as a result of which you've achieved more success. So how do we extrapolate that? Do you think this is something that's also important to what's happening in European politics?
I think it applies to European politics. I think it applies to national politics, other states, other big blue cities. I think if you really want to make a dent, politically speaking, you cannot just offer a milquetoast version of the prevailing orthodoxy. You need to provide an alternative worldview. You need to paint an alternative picture. You need to provide alternative solutions, and you need to really go on the offensive. No one respects a weak person. No one respects a weak party. No one respects a weak political movement. If you want to grow, if you really want to establish yourself, you need to be firm on your beliefs and principles. And that's what we've done here in New York. And I think we've seen success. Many of the people that we've helped elect, that we've staffed their offices, they are staunch conservatives, they're populists, they're right-wingers, and they're serving here in the city council in New York City. And we've seen growth. We've seen our percentages for mayoral races go up. We've seen even the gubernatorial race. Lee Zeldin, he's a Trump Republican, and he got almost 47% in the last gubernatorial race in New York. So all the prevailing wisdom that dominated the political discourse in places like New York and elsewhere has been disproven over the last few years. They were told, run to the center, be more moderate. And the more we did that, the more we lost. And we hit a low point in terms of Republican representation here in New York, both in our Senate, in our Assembly, in our City Council, in all of our statewide races, following that mentality. And I think it's very ironic that the second we began to shift to the right, the second we began to embrace more right-wing talking points, more populist rhetoric, we began to grow as a party. We were instrumental in organizing President Trump's recent rally in the Bronx, and there were close to 20,000 people there. there. And they were coming out. They were excited. The crowd was certainly local to the Bronx. And I think the only reason he was able to receive that sort of welcome is because his type of rhetoric, his right-wing politics, his populism does appeal to a lot of people in the city, a lot of working class people, a lot of forgotten men and women who are not served by the elites. They're not served by globalism. They're not served by mass migration. They're not served by pro-criminal policies. They're not served by, endless foreign wars and foreign interventionisms. They're actually would be much better served by a slate of policies at the state, local, and national level that are actually in the interest of the people. And that would be, keeping our money here, not engaging in endless foreign conflict, closing our borders, locking up criminals, instituting, policies that are actually directed for economic growth, fighting the systemic corruption and incompetence of our institutions. All of these things are policies that many people can get behind. And I think in times past, we've had a party that failed to bring those messages to different cohorts of people. They failed to discuss it in terms that they can understand. And I think the beauty of the Trump movement is that they are bringing these different ideas. They're bringing this view of government to the masses. It's not a overly intellectual movement. It's not a very snobby movement, if that's the right word. It's a movement of the people, by the people, and for the people. And that populism is surging. That populism is ascendant. And I think we're seeing that in Europe. We're seeing that in the United States. And I think that's the future of the American body politic.
So this brings me to another question I want to ask you is, so if someone who's not an American looks at America and they are on the conservative side and they say, well, President Trump is a bit too harsh or a bit too populist, and maybe it would be better to have a president or a candidate who's a bit more polished and sort of more, what you would expect of someone who's more presidential, whatever that means. And I've seen with you guys, and you guys are very close to Trump. When he made that speech in the Bronx, I saw the speech. He thanked you personally by name. So how would you explain to someone who says maybe the Republicans need someone who's a bit more moderate or a bit more polished? Why is Trump the person?
Look, I think again, it's this previous viewpoint of how to campaign and how to engage in politics that has been just flawed. I think for every supposed voter that Trump has lost with his rhetoric, with his character, with his harshness, if you want to call it that, he's probably picked up 5 or 10 new voters. And I think that's how we have to look at it. We have to look at it in the gross numbers. We have to look at it in totality, not just, what did he net? We have to see, okay, maybe he lost 1 voter here in the suburbs. He lost with some college educated, upper middle class white voters, but he's gaining with, high school educated working class voters. He's gaining with working class Hispanic and black voters. So on the net, he's gaining. And I think at the end of the day, you have to also understand that we're living in a new age, a new media age, a new information age. The way that we communicate, the way that we get our message across is very different than it was 10, 20, 30 years ago. They used to say that way back when you needed to have a voice for radio to do very well in politics. Then you needed a face for television. Well, now you need a certain authenticity. You need a certain rawness. You need a certain force of character and a larger than life personality to succeed in the world of social media, where you're being spliced and diced into very short viral moments and viral clips, and where people are looking for a certain authenticity. When you tweet, for example, when you post now, not called tweeting anymore, they want to make sure it's actually you saying that. They want to see how you actually feel. And I think people may not agree with everything he says. They may not like how he handles everything in terms of his rhetoric or how he presents himself, but they at least appreciate that he is real and authentic and he's acting as himself. And I think many people fail to understand. They would always write these long, lofty op-eds and ask themselves all these questions on these different panels and shows and say, well, how could a Manhattan billionaire appeal to white working class voters in Michigan or Pennsylvania or Wisconsin? It doesn't make any sense. How does he appeal to all these different groups that are so different from him in terms of his class, in terms of their income, in terms of their upbringing? And the answer is simple. It's because he's not trying to pretend that he's anything he isn't. He's presenting himself exactly how he is, who he is, and people like that. They gravitate to that because that's a true leader. That's a trait of a true leader. And I think for so long that they have become sick and tired of these consultant-approved and consultant-driven candidates who have these rehearsed lines, who have this rehearsed rhetoric, who are too buttoned up, who are too, seemingly perfect, but then they have so many skeletons in their closet, and they're never what they present themselves to be, and they're usually moral hypocrites at the very least. Trump, on the other hand, he doesn't pretend to be anything he isn't. He doesn't pretend to be, this, very puritanical man of God. He is a New York billionaire. He's a former playboy. He's a celebrity, larger-than-life character. He is presenting himself as he is, and just that authenticity, just that ability to be truthful in how you come across, did him wonders in the primary in 15 and 16, the general election in 16 and beyond, and it's been able to create this larger-than-life personality. It's been able to create this unstoppable political movement simply because he was able to enter into a stage of, just mediocre people who were pretending to be something that they weren't, who didn't really have any views of their own, who didn't really have any personality, and he was able to stand out and stand, tall among them. And he was able to fight. He showed a level of grit. He punched back. People liked his mean tweets. People say all the time they didn't like his mean tweets, but more people liked it than they hated it. And he was able to come onto a stage of candidates and call out basic truths, saying the Iraq War was a mistake, saying that we're being screwed on trade deals. I mean, these are things that had been, verboten in the Republican Party for many years. And funny enough, these were actually stances that he has held consistently for the better part of 30, 40 years. You can go and look at clips of him on TV shows and radio shows from the 70s and 80s and 90s, and he was talking about the same exact things. He was talking about trade imbalances. He was talking about forever wars. He was talking about, the incompetence of our government. He was talking about the endless foreign interventions. He was talking about the border crisis. All these things he discussed for a long time, well before he entered into the political arena, and just goes to show that he has core issues that he is committed to and he's willing to fight for, and that was such a refreshing thing in the American political scene.
Yeah, it's almost as if governing and politics has become somewhat of a science where you can't take a position on something without first checking the polls, or without first having a meeting with some consultants and having focus groups and the consequence, it might have worked for a while, but the consequence seemed to have been that people just felt that it doesn't resonate with them anymore. These people were so polished, and they said all the right things, or perceived to have, but they were not relatable, and people became annoyed and alienated and disillusioned. And someone like Trump came in and he sort of threw the whole table over and said, well, let's do it differently.
Well, it was both, that they were saying what they were supposed to say, but then they also weren't effectuating it. They weren't acting on it. They had been talking about a lot of these different issues, even social issues, fighting against abortion, fighting for tax cuts, deregulations, and then they would get to office and they never did anything. Bush said the same things. He didn't really govern that way when he was in office. Bush ran on not engaging in foreign conflict either, and he got us in the Iraq War, So and this was even more prevalent on the state level. This was even more prevalent in Congress, where they all said the right things, they fundraised off the right things, and they didn't govern that way when they were in positions of power. When we had majorities, when they're in positions of government at the governor's level, at the gubernatorial level, or elsewhere. But I also think you bring up an interesting point that it also, again, destroys this notion that you simply have to follow the polling and follow what's popular. I think what President Trump did is he shifted the Overton window. He brought a lot of these issues to the forefront. He brought a lot of these issues into the political dynamic. He really reinvigorated the issue of mass migration and the border and this illegal immigrant invasion. He really brought back issues related to trade. I mean, we had not really been seriously talking about tariffs and protectionism for, generations, even though the Republican Party was founded on those principles. The Republican Party had largely given up on issues of controlling the border. They were trying to push for amnesty. They were trying to push for, immigration reform that really would have opened the border and really started to legalize millions of people. But President Trump fought back, and he is now bringing issues of trade, issues of the border back to the forefront. Again, I mentioned it before, it used to be considered completely unacceptable to question the validity of the Iraq War and all these foreign interventions and, NATO commitments and all these other things. He brought that to the forefront. Now that's a standard talking point for the Republican Party. We've seen just recently with his picking J.D. Vance to be his vice president, in many ways his successor. J.D. Vance is very much of this populist strain in the Republican Party, and it just goes to show that the Republican Party today in 2024 is a completely different institution ideologically than it was even in 2016 or even before. I mean, that's a tremendous amount of change to happen in less than a decade. And the reason it happened that quickly is largely due to Trump shifting the Overton window, making topics that previously were not socially acceptable now becoming part of the normal rhetoric of the Republican Party, taking issues that people wanted to avoid, and now there are flagship issues. And in fact, now it's a popular issue. Maybe it wasn't popular a few years ago, but now the vast majority, I think even a supermajority of Americans favor mass deportations. That's something that would have been unheard of just a few years ago. And even then, we've also seen shifting on issues such as abortion. Now we've had successes with the repeal of Roe v. Wade. It shifted back to the states. We're now able to actually govern on these issues. We're actually able to message on these issues. We're actually able to talk about them in ways that we couldn't do 10, 15 years ago. So all of these things show that we've seen a lot of accelerated movements ideologically since the beginning of Trump's emergence onto the political scene. And I think one of his lasting legacies will be how quickly and how radically he shifted the Republican Party. And I think he's just the beginning. I think that shift is only going to continue for years to come with people that are going to make, Trump look like a moderate in comparison.
Well, I remember back in, when was Obama's last, 2012, I think, that election, when Obama won, the talk was, and the overarching view was that this is the end of the Republican Party. Yes. This is now Trump, Obama having won his second term. The Republicans are dead. They would need to come up with something new, or some new party or something.
Yes.
And that has shifted dramatically in just 4 years, actually.
It's actually interesting you bring that up. I was trying to look up here for a book. It was called The Emerging Democrat Majority, and it basically predicted that the Republican Party would become this regional party. It would have no more national success. It would be shut out of national governance for a generation. And they were very arrogant. They were really very much high on their own supply, and frankly that was an election we should have and could have won with the right candidate. Yes. I mean, if we had run someone similar to Trump, he would have beat Obama. I think Romney was the worst possible candidate we could have ran, and I think it just goes to show how out of touch Republican Party elites, the consultant class, the donor class, were and still are. And these are still this is still a problem for us moving forward, because a lot of the levers of power institutionally are still controlled by a lot of people who are living in another era, and they're still thinking it's a different country than what it is. They don't understand the time we're living in. They don't understand the issues. They don't understand what we're up against. They don't understand the enemy that we're up against in the left, and they're basing their politics on a very flawed view of the world. But I think what you're bringing up is very interesting, because the left really thought, again, in many ways, it's a broader issue. They thought they were at the end of history. I mean, that's what a lot of...
The new end of history.
The new end of history. They thought they were end of history politically, electorally, in this more focused subset, namely American politics. They thought, this was a new party system. It was going to be, supermajority Democrat rule and control for generations to come. They'll enact, all their new agenda and platforms and all the rest. And that will be just the pinnacle of progressivism. And of course, it was all a lie. It all fell apart. And it was based on a lot of assumptions. And it was based off of, a lot of, things that were only very, temporary in terms of their impact on the electorate. And I think the Obama phenomenon, he certainly was, he certainly was a figure that changed a lot about our country for the worse in my mind. But at the same time, I think the Obama legacy was largely completely eradicated just in 4 years of President Trump being in office. And I think if President Trump is to win again, I think he will, and I want him to, I think it's only going to further cement that Obama progressive mid-2000s legacy is just going to go back into the dustbin of history. And again, it just goes to show that they were basing, in that thesis, they were basing their electoral dominance on continuing to win working class voters, particularly white working class voters, particularly unions. And these are all groups that have shifted en masse to the Republican Party. They've shifted en masse to Trump. I mean, we just saw the head of the Teamsters addressing the Republican National Convention. We saw the head of the local steam fitters, who this club actually introduced the Republicans, because we formed our labor caucus with the local steam fitters, and we set up an event with President Trump visiting one of their job sites, and as a consequence, the head of that organization went to go speak at the Republican National Convention. All of these things are shifting our way, and the old calculus that the Democrats were basing their forever government on was based on things that didn't remain. They weren't able to maintain the white working class vote. They weren't able to maintain the middle class white vote. They're losing ground in urban America, even in New York. I mean, if you look at the numbers, Republicans and conservatives are gaining in all the major urban areas, on the margins, of course, but a percent or two in a place like New York counts for a hell of a lot more than a percent or two in a rural area. They were still counting on rural Democrats in certain areas of the country, both in the South and the Midwest, still remaining somewhat competitive. But all that fell apart. They lost rural, Democrat support. They lost union support. They lost white working class support. So what did they fall back on? They fell back on mass migration. I think what we're seeing in the Democrat Party is the destruction of that vision of a generational political dominance of this Obama coalition. That Obama coalition fell apart, and they've shifted beyond persuasion politics. They're not interested in winning you over in a battle of ideas. They're not interested in fighting fairly in the forum of democracy and engaging in discourse. They're simply trying to change the electorate. They want to flood the country with new voters. They want to grant mass amnesty to create an entire new voting bloc, an entire new working class. And then if they can't do it that way, they're also simultaneously going to take over all the narrative formation institutions, such as higher education, such as the mass media, such as pop culture, such as corporate America, turn it radically leftist through slow takeovers, Fabian style, and indoctrinate the youth, scare the rest of the people through canceling and doxing and social pressure and social stigma. And combining all these different things into one, you have a recipe where they could assert political dominance in the way that they envisioned back in 2012. But they had to do it in a much different and a far more ruthless way, because people simply did not buy into their vision of the world. So what was the alternative? Well, if you're not going to support us voluntarily, we're going to change the electorate and we're going to indoctrinate your kids. And that's really the fight we're up against.
And change America dramatically. In a sense, destroy what America used to be for hundreds of years. Yes. And replace it with something new when we don't really know what that something new is going to look like.
It may look like South Africa.
Yeah.
It may look like Brazil. It may look like a lot of places that have been struggling in the last few decades. I think
it's not going to look like Switzerland.
It's not going to look like Switzerland. I can assure you of that. But we're going to return to the lowest common denominator. And I think, I think fundamentally we're dealing with a group of elites that are very nihilistic and very power hungry, and they view this country as an economic zone that they can extract wealth from, and they view it as a place where they can cement their political control by any means necessary. And if that means destroying the country, if that means making the country poorer, more divided, less cohesive, less united, more unsafe, then so be it, as long as they can maintain control. So they have no care for the future of this country, for the posterity of this country. They only care about power, and power for power's sake. And I think this is a very nihilistic group of people that we've never really encountered before. I don't think they believe in God. I don't think they believe in a higher power or higher purpose. And because of that makes them extremely dangerous. And I think there are some Republicans who don't understand that. There are some conservatives who don't understand that. They still think that we're playing by the rules we were 20, 30, 40 years ago. And they're very naive in how they approach politics, and they don't understand that this is a blood sport and that they're playing for keeps. They're playing to win, and they're willing to even kill if necessary. And they're willing to lock up their political opponents. They're willing to bankrupt them. They're willing to defame whoever they have to defame. They're willing to destroy their opposition. They're not playing this civil gentleman-like game of politics. They're playing a completely different game, and until we understand what that game is, we're going to continue to lose.
Yeah. So this assassination attempt, I mean, there's memes all around, but it was very close. It was very, very close. And and he would have been dead. But so my question is, how did this affect him? Because it seems almost he was always almost a martyr, but in a sense he is a martyr, but one who survived. What's your view, and what's the talk in town on how that affected his prospects and his image?
Well, we can only speculate. I can't get into his head, but from the outside, I mean, I think it certainly is going to have a huge impact on how he approaches things, on his psychology. He definitely looked very different. Seeing him at the convention, you saw him when he was listening to the speeches and all the rest. He looked a little more somber. He looked a little more serious. He has already publicly credited him surviving as an act of God. He's had, his views on religion over the years. I don't think, he was necessarily the most religious of individuals, but I certainly think if he were to have a spiritual religious awakening, I think that would be the moment to do it. I think it's certainly going to strengthen his resolve. I think he fully understands now. I think he did before, but I think now there's no mistaking it. I think he fully understands the type of forces we're up against, the type of opposition, the sort of opposition that is willing to use bloodshed to achieve their ends. And I think even seeing the fallout from the assassination attempt, there were some very bad people saying some horrible things online and elsewhere about how they were upset that the bullet didn't hit the target, that they were happy that Corey Comparatore, the firefighter who tragically lost his life protecting his wife and daughter, that they were happy that he passed. I mean,
Trump staged the whole thing.
Trump staged the whole thing. I mean, all of these things, between the cheering on the death, the cheering on, the wishing that the bullet had hit, and claiming it was staged, I think it just shows that there is a certain level of mass psychosis in the population. There's a certain segment of the population that's just so far gone, morally, spiritually, intellectually and otherwise, that I think they're beyond persuasion politics. I think they're beyond saving. I don't think they're going to be convinced of the rights of our policies. I don't think they're going to be convinced by any sort of utilitarian approach, on our economic policies, or our border and immigration policies. I mean, they are tribal, and they are thoroughly programmed and frankly brainwashed. And I think that's what the Democrats have accomplished over the last few decades. They've infected our institutions slowly, and they've turned them into places to churn out loyal party supporters and loyal party voters in a very Soviet-esque style or totalitarian style way, without it being in a totalitarian country. So we're in this strange place where we have all of the veneer of a free society, where we have all the trappings of a free society, but under the surface there are a lot of elements of our institutions that are extremely totalitarian in nature. And I think, going back to your question, though, I don't want to get off track, but I think President Trump is certainly a changed man. I think he's more committed now than ever, and I think it's certainly going to change him, and I think we're really going to see that change when he's in office. I think that's really where we're going to see the response. And I think who he hires, who he appoints, how he governs. Obviously, a lot of things we'll learn from the first term. I think a lot of things are going to be different this new term, and I think it's going to be a far more aggressive, far more right-wing government than we've ever had before. And I think that's why they're very scared, because they recognize that they're not going to have the same Trump that they had in 2016 or 2017. This is a Trump that's more seasoned. This is a Trump that's has more of a fight in him than ever before. This is a Trump that's more focused. This is a Trump that has a better team around him, that has better people around him, that has better advisors around him, that already knows more experience, already knows how to operate in D.C., already knows how to operate in the swamp. And if he wins, could very well be entering into a situation where we have trifecta government control, both chambers, the Supreme Court, both chambers, the executive, and the judiciary. All three branches could be firmly under our control at the federal level. So I think they're very worried. They're very scared of this prospect. And I think that's why we're seeing desperate actions from desperate people. And people are now going, down rabbit holes and conspiracy theories, and they're always trying to proclaim that the enemy, in this case, the left, is playing some sort of 4D chess and is a few steps ahead. I would say right now what we're experiencing the last few weeks is us winning. We're not used to winning. We're not used to how it feels, but I think the left are in complete disarray. I think them falling back on Kamala Harris is an act of desperation, with their back against the wall, being in a corner more than anything. saying, the fact that they're trying to push out Biden this late in the game just shows that they are so scared of President Trump's return to power and seriously think it's a real possibility. But I think all of this is a good sign. We shouldn't rest on our laurels. We should double down. I think that's what President Trump is doing. He has not slowed down on the campaign trail. He's hit the campaign trail. Honestly, again, with your original question, I think him appointing J.D. Vance, who is the one candidate that was being discussed who is to Trump's right, I think that shows deep down where President Trump is mentally is mentally after that race. He's after that, after that near attempted assassination. I think he's now looking for a successor. He's looking for someone further to the right, and he's looking for someone to be an insurance policy, because you could kill Trump, but you're only going to replace him with someone who's further to his right, and that of J.D. Vance. So all good signs for someone like me who's firmly on the right, but we're going to have to see how things develop over the coming weeks. I think, they're getting desperate. Biden was probably their best candidate. All the polling shows that Kamala is even weaker than Biden. But I think they're willing to take a chance on her because they thought that that Biden was completely toast. So let's see what happens.
Yeah. So I have one last question. You've not been to South Africa, but quite a few members of the club has been there, and I've known you guys now for a few years. We met at CPAC in Hungary. As I said, I've spoken at the club, and if I may say, we are having some discussions about perhaps arranging a trip for the New York Young Republicans to visit South Africa. And so my question is, why is there an interest in South Africa? Why did you guys invite me to speak at tonight's event and to speak at your club? And why are you thinking about coming to South Africa? Why is it relevant?
Well, I think South Africa and more in particular the plight of the Afrikaners and more broadly the white South African people, I think has become sort of a talking point and a point of discussion in conservative and right-wing circles, because many people see what's happened in South Africa as a potential future for the United States. And I mentioned that briefly earlier, but I think what you're seeing in South Africa is really the full realization, the end point, the culmination of the end of this sort of racialized politics and rhetoric of the left. When you get to the point where you're trying to find a way to justify kill the Boer, I think that's really coming very soon to these shores. They'll just have to replace the Boer with another term that be more relevant to the American people. But I think many on the right, myself included, see what's happening in South Africa and see what's happening in other countries as well as a glimpse into the future of the United States. I think on the flip side, we're also very interested and inspired by the efforts that you yourself through Alpha Forum and other organizations and what's happening in Irania, and specifically we're inspired and we're interested in the efforts made towards more self-government, more self-sufficiency, an ability to operate almost as a parallel set of institutions outside of, or alongside rather, the mainstream institutions of South Africa. We're interested in how, you're building communities, you're strengthening communities, you're protecting your communities. I mean, these are all very valuable insights that an American conservative and a declining United States would be interested in. And in some cases, as I mentioned, you're a few years ahead of us in some respects. And I think there's a lot to be learned. I think there's a lot to be studied. And also, of course, I think we share many similar values, and we share many similar cultural traits, many historical similarities, and many historical bonds. And I think for all these reasons and more, I think there's been a renewed interest in what's happening in South Africa. And I think for those reasons, we've wanted you to speak. You're at the forefront of speaking on these issues, writing about these issues, leading from the front on these issues. And of course, you speak good English. So we would love to have you here to address our audience and talk about it. But listen, I think what we're seeing in South Africa is a complete disgrace. I mean, what we've seen over the years about the murders, the cold-blooded murders of many farmers, the persecution, the legalized persecution of many white South Africans, in particular Afrikaners, what we've seen happen there is despicable. But we've seen the same sort of rhetoric that enables those actions beginning to pop up in the United States in certain left-wing circles. So I think we have the same enemy. I think we have the same ideological enemy, and I think it's emanating in somewhat different ways and in somewhat different stages. But the international left has been always very keen to have an international left because they learn from each other. They learn about their shared experiences and problems and solutions, and that's what makes them a very effective fighting force. I think on the right, we tend to be a little bit more parochial in our outlook, a little more isolated in our outlook, but whether or not you consider yourselves on the right, I think we are in a shared fight. That's why we always engage in discussion with our friends in Hungary. That's where I met you in Budapest, where we met with other parties, other political organizations, other grassroots organizations talking about their struggles, the shared struggles, the solutions, how we fight back, how we've succeeded, how we failed. And I think in the case of South Africa, it's probably the most extreme of them all. Because you don't even have a state really for your own people. You're a stateless people within a country, and you're building things from the ground up, literally and physically, building a new city, building new towns, building bridges, schools. I saw something recently launching a school for pilots in Orania. So all of these things that we take for granted, you are starting from scratch. And I think, we're getting to a point in some parts of our country where, the social fabric is going to decay to such a point that we may very well be at a point again where we're going to have to rebuild as a society. So I think it's interesting. I think it's fascinating. And I genuinely feel compassion and sympathy and camaraderie with what you guys are going through and what you guys are trying to achieve. And I think for all those reasons and more, I know others share the same sentiments I do. I think that makes you a great speaker to come here and is the reason for our current and future collaboration.
Gavin Wax, thank you very much.
Thank you, sir.